I would like to now introduce today's presenter. Michael Jansen is Chief Research Guru at Everest Group. As co-founder of our research practice, Michael offers profound insights and analysis to enterprises and service providers alike. He is particularly well known for his ability to hypothesize clever and challenging ideas based on his fact-based insights across business and IT processes, sourcing models, and industries. Shirley Hung, Vice President, Research at Everest Group, advises senior stakeholders of global services, including enterprises, service providers, and investors, in their strategic mandates and initiatives. Her responsibilities include leading Everest Group research in the areas of finance and accounting outsourcing, procurement outsourcing, and customer experience management services. Abhishek Sharma, partner at Everest Group, is a member of the pricing assurance team and assists clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and resourcing cost rationalization. Abhishek's responsibilities include providing delivery leadership on all of Everest Group's pricing assurance engagements. I'd now like to pass it over to Michael.
All right, thank you, Lucy, and welcome everybody. As I was just looking at the attendee list, this is particularly a hot topic for this industry. And so we've got a good audience here. We've got some really good content that's fresh. We just finished up the analysis. And so what we're going to walk through today is really talking about how the pricing models are changing. We're going to show you data on that. Then we're going to talk about the trends in outsourcing and then some of our key findings. And so we're going to take each of these three sections, show you some data, and then do a discussion around that. As we move to the next slide here, I have a general philosophy when it comes down to pricing. I've been in this industry for 30 years, that pricing is a very key component of any deal or any relationship between an enterprise or a buyer and a supplier. And having that right is extremely critical. As many of you know, that if you've been part of an outsourcing relationship, there's lots of things that get promised in the sales cycle. Everybody's happy. Everybody's looking for the right interest in terms of making sure we get married. But as contracts and relationships develop, what you'll quickly realize is what you have on your invoice, what you see in the payment process, what gets delivered every month, will be a key critical component of what actually gets delivered. So there has to be good alignment between the pricing units and pricing elements and what you actually want to get out of your relationship. And so what we have now in the industry, you have a bit of a disruption going on as we have automation increasingly becoming important in these outsourcing relationships, and less focus on the FTE labor arbitrage that we saw for the last decade or decade and a half. There's becoming an increasing pressure to change the way we build our relationships and the pricing structures therein. So getting it right is critical. And so why don't we let's start with some basic definitions. And so Abhishek, what do we mean by the terms we're going to use today? Abhishek?
Hey, thanks, Michael. So before we get into the details of the findings, just some fundamentals for everyone's benefit. So output-based pricing is all about the operational result. We're talking about processed invoices, processed claims. What's the operational output? Outcome-based pricing is how we link it to the actual business outcome. So, for example, what are the savings achieved from sourcing and category management? Can the pricing be linked to that? So that's a clear linkage with cost savings, which is an outcome. And then, of course, input-based pricing, ostensibly, the simplest one, is linked on a rate per hour, per day, or per month basis. So we'll be using these terms quite extensively during the next few minutes. So just wanted to set some background on them.
Yeah, and for anybody that says, hey, could we really be moving away from, kind of the labor arbitrage input pricing into maybe more output or outcome? I want to go back and just relate that we actually used to do most of the outsourcing deals in output-based pricing with some outcome back in the 80s and 90s. Most of the deals were based on a per insurance claim, a per checking account, a savings account, airline ticket processed. Most of the deals that I remember early in my career, first half of my career, I should say, were based on output. So when we moved to input-based pricing around labor arbitrage, that was actually quite a big change. So, it's a little bit of, have we come full circle, and that's what we're going to talk about and look at it in the data. So we structured the data. We're going to talk about those adoption trends. We're going to talk about the impact, and then we're going to talk about specific practices. So that's how the data is going to roll out here. And what we thought we'd do is, before we show you our data, we wanted to get some input from you, the participants in this call, and ask you our first quick poll question. So as we open up the quick poll here, the first question we want to ask is, are you considering making a change to the way you pay for your outsourcing services? And what we're looking for here is a yes or no, or 3 grades of maybe. So yes, I have declared intent to make changes. Maybe I would like to do it, but thinking the change would be hard or difficult. We're in the maybe investigating options, maybe not sure if the change will be adding value, and those that just say, hey, no, not yet, but I'm still on this webinar. Okay, we've got a good number of votes here. Give it another 10 seconds and we'll close it out. All right, this is an interesting distribution. Let's go ahead and close it out and post those results. All right, we're solid in the middle of the maybes. We've got a little bit on the wings there for yes and no, and then we've got 75% of the numbers are in the maybe category. So I think that's a clear sign that we have people that are thinking about that. That's maybe why the numbers on the attendance of this webinar are high. So let's take it from there. All right, Shirley, you're going to lead us into our first discussion slide.
Yes. So over the past few years, we have been seeing a trend towards outcome and output-based pricing, both across IT services and business process outsourcing. And this trend is expected to continue at pace. In the upcoming next 2 to 3 years, we are predicting that less than 1/4 of the spend within IT applications, IP infrastructure, and BPO will continue utilizing input-based pricing models, such as price per FTE. This is a huge change, as outcome and output-based pricing will encompass more than the majority of spend. For example, the expected shift to outcome-based pricing in IT infrastructure will increase about 50% from the current level of 16% of spend to 23% of the spend over the next few years.
Yeah, and Shirley, just to put all of these numbers into perspective, how we actually use these as part of our analysis is showcased on the next slide. So to highlight the impact achieved and differentiation factors, which was the intent, we split the participants into half, right? So we defined the impact first on 4 key parameters. Obviously, cost, no prizes for guessing that. Customer satisfaction, service levels, which is metrics, and business performance. So as you can see, there's some quite a clear differentiation among the high impact participants, which saw typical average uplifts of 22 to 24% plus across all or most of these parameters. Whereas on the low impact realization participants, it's in the low teens and high single digits. So that kind of was used as in the subsequent slides. You'll see the differentiation between high impact and low impact participants. This just adds some more background as to how we define that.
So without further ado, let's dive into the detailed findings from our study. From a satisfaction standpoint, it is no wonder that we see the trend towards output and outcome-based pricing. Even those organizations that demonstrate a low impact on improvement has an overall satisfaction rate of 50% or higher. However, as expected, satisfaction levels are much higher in those organizations achieving high improvement impact. For both IT services and business process outsourcing, the greatest degree of differentiation in terms of satisfaction is in provider behavior. Satisfaction with provider behavior in BPO is only at 20% in low impact organizations, compared to 70% in high-impact organizations, thereby demonstrating the importance that organizations place on service provider behaviors aligning to performance results. Moving on, when we look at the reasons that organizations are looking to adopt output and outcome-based pricing models, again, we see some commonalities in the drivers between IT services and BPO services. High-impact organizations in both areas tend to focus on generating cost savings, ensuring delivery quality, and incentivizing continuous improvement. High-impact organizations also tend to focus on risk sharing as a driver for output and outcome-based pricing to a greater extent than low-impact organizations. This difference is more than 2-to-1 in the area of BPO services.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. So these are some pretty interesting numbers covering, some tenets around satisfaction, some tenets around, what are the drivers. And as we put it into some more perspective and see, before getting into the detailed findings, we do have a case study. So if we move on, we'll see that, one of our clients, which is a global APAC-based conglomerate, is facing some pretty common challenges as we see across many enterprises around, especially within the procurement organization, which was the scope. High degree of decentralization, maverick spend, lack of processes, fragmented technology ecosystem, and they outsource it to a global provider with the intent to streamline things. And they did get a degree of standardization and compliance, among other things, as you can see. Also, there were some pretty solid results, both in terms of cost savings, as well as non-cost benefits like buying behavior and compliance. Now, one of the things which was also important in this story was the role that the pricing model played. So typically here they used a hybrid pricing model. So there was an FTE-based model along with something that was linked to the actual savings achieved. Right. So this basically what does is that it drives the right service provider behavior, and which in this case led to some quite tangible cost and non-cost benefits. So again, just to summarize, you could have all the right intent, you could have the right service provider, you could have the right technology ecosystem, but as long as the pricing model is designed to incentivize value rather than just focusing on the lowest cost, we have seen that is definitely value that's left on the table.
Okay, and I'm just looking at the questions here. There was a question about how we're defining definition of impact, and so what we were looking for is all the data set we basically broke into high impact and low impact, and the high impact ones were based on the content we showed on slides 10. So when you get the deck, you can go back and look at it. But it was who were the population that was getting the best cost savings, the best customer satisfaction, service levels, and business performance. So we divided the population who was getting those kind of results that were better, and then we're looking at the things that were done to make that happen. So hopefully that answers the question. The data will be there for you to look at in more detail when we distribute the slides. What I would like to do now is open it up to quick poll number 2. And so the question here is, do you think your service provider welcomes moving to outcome and output-based pricing? So for those that are talking with their service provider, what kind of responses do they think they're getting or are they getting? So one is, no, I don't think they want to make this kind of change. Not sure if they will view it as a win-win. So somebody loses and they're not going to bring it up. They hope you don't bring it up. They have brought up the topic, but nothing's gone on. Nothing's happened. Or more positively, they are actively working with us on the topic, or we already have it in place and it's working well. All right, I'm looking at the numbers come in. It's a horse race. There's 3 answers that are almost exactly the same results numerically. Okay, we'll give it another 4 seconds. Close it out here. Wow, it's still a horse race. Back the number. Oh, one of them just flipped, guys. All right. I feel like I'm watching a horse race. All right, so actually we have a tie, almost a 3-way tie here. So we have let's look at the ends there. No, there's no. I don't think they want to make the change, and we already have it. Those are the 2 spectrum. Got only about 10% each. But in the middle, we have 26, 28, and 28. So equal numbers for not sure if they view this as a win-win. So not sure if they want to do it. Maybe the acknowledgement that they brought it up and they have nothing's happened yet, and they're already working with us. So we got all kinds of pretty much all over the board in terms of actual workings to make things change. Interesting. Okay, so now we're going to move into the key findings. So we showed you some data. Now we're going to move into more of the discussion portion of the analysis. So
sure. Michael, yeah, moving on, and just a quick note, as I was saying through the survey or the poll results, some of those messages or themes, interestingly, will get reflected in the subsequent slides. So it's kind of interesting to see some correlations that I'm drawing, which Shirley and I will just talk through. So in terms of the 5 most important findings, you have that on the screen. Some of these might appear as expected, some of these will appear counterintuitive. But if I were to kind of look at it at even a higher level, right, and just give you 2 broad takeaways, right? One is that the basics need to be right, right? So things like success linkage with tangibles, use of technology enablers like better reporting and analytics, adequate change in governance or scope clauses, right? These seem to be pretty much brass tacks, table stakes, but we've seen and the results show that they seem to have a high correlation with high impact achievement. So that's one takeaway for me. The second is that a lot of the push for moving to output and outcome-based pricing needs to come from enterprises themselves. And in particular, we've seen that service delivery management teams, given that they're pretty close to the operations, they tend to be well positioned to drive some of that change. And also, as a corollary to that, be prepared as enterprises to face low proactiveness at times from providers, especially when the size of the prize is high. And we'll talk about this seemingly counterintuitive fact in some subsequent slides.
So the first practice that we want to discuss is defining success. It's important to be transparent about what you're looking to achieve. So what does success look like for your organization? For most companies, at the top of the list of success criteria is having demonstrable cost savings, achieving greater customer satisfaction, and enabling greater alignment with business objectives. In BPO, the differentiating practice for high impact organizations is that they are 50% more likely to define success by calling out costs compared to low impact organizations, and over 25% more likely to focus on creating greater flexibility. Whereas in the area of IT services, high impact organizations are nearly 25% more likely to define success by achieving greater customer satisfaction. Abhishek, what do you think we can take away from all of this?
Yeah, absolutely, Shirley. So if you move on, we'll see that enterprises pursuing what I call the basic trifecta of cost savings, better customer satisfaction, and enhanced flexibility tend to obtain higher impact. And the way I see this is because all these are pretty tangible items, right? So they link back to the basics. Cost savings, you need to have a very strong view of what your objective is and be able to define that. Better customer satisfaction and also enhanced flexibility to be defined in some way. If we look at aiming for higher productivity and alignment with business, these are more like second order outcomes or resultants of a lot of the basics that come into play. So it's good to have these as broader objectives, but defining them through that tends to have a counterintuitive effect. So again, just to summarize, best to go with the basics, start with them, and then see how that goes.
Sounds great. So moving on to practice 2, we found that contrary to what many people think, the initiator of output and outcome-based pricing in high-impact improvement companies is not procurement. Instead, the initiator of pricing model changes in high-impact improvement companies is 200% more likely to be service delivery management in the area of IT services. When we look at BPO, the difference is lower, but still significant at 85%, with nearly a quarter of initiators at high impact organizations being service delivery management. In addition, if we go to the next slide, whether or not procurement and contract management is centralized does not influence the impact realized from moving to output and outcome-based pricing models. We asked about the operating models for procurement and the degree of centralization for IT services and BPO, but there was no significant differentiation for high impact and low impact organizations. Abhishek, what do you think about this?
Absolutely. So on the two slides which you just spoke about, the two sets of graphs, Jerry, one area is where one of my ingoing hypothesis was proven wrong, and I'm happy to admit that. Right? But before that, I'll just cover the first point around pricing models. So pricing models per se are often linked with procurement and vendor management. When you talk about pricing, you think they are the people in charge. Now, this is true because they have an important role to play, but service delivery management, as is seen, is an equal stakeholder as pricing drives service provider behavior. So when SDM or service delivery management, they are the ones driving the change. They're conscious of operational constraints, they're conscious of realities of service delivery, and then perhaps in that sense, much better placed to drive that change and be much closer to the change management practice. So that's one of the, as we tie up the findings with what could be potential reasons, that's something I see. Mm-hmm. Now, coming to the hypothesis which I mentioned, which was proven wrong, at the start of the study, my assumption was that perhaps many of the high impact achievers would be where the procurement organization is highly standardized or centralized in GBS kind of an organization, which clearly, obviously has its advantages, but we couldn't drive any specific correlation. Now, this could potentially be because of the fact that that structure works very well at a highest level for broader efficiencies, but pricing model changes are very much at a ground and tactical level. Right? Mm-hmm. You can have a strategic decision, but they need to start working. That's when the rubber hits the road. Mm-hmm. So that's why perhaps the top level structures don't appear to have that much of an impact as perhaps I had imagined earlier, to be honest.
Yeah, that seems to make sense to me. I find this next practice particularly interesting. The degree of impact that an organization achieves from moving towards an output and outcome-based pricing model seems to be achieved despite low proactivity from service providers. So a third of high impact organizations state that their service provider was minimally proactive, neutral, or they actually met resistance from their service providers in making these pricing changes. Abhishek, what do you think this means for companies that, the majority of the companies here on this webinar in terms of wanting to pursue their pricing model changes?
Yeah. And I can actually link that with one of the questions where both parties in the poll, where a number of participants said that perhaps both parties don't see this as a win-win, right? So again, on a lighter note, as to say, everyone will lend you $1. Very few will lend you $100. Right? So service providers, for obvious reasons and the right reasons, right, will want to retain their revenue streams. Many times what happens is that a sudden change in pricing model could have an impact on overall revenue realized. And when the potential impact is high, there is bound to be some resistance. Right? And that's what I mentioned, that when the size of the prize is high, perhaps you see a low level of proactiveness. On the other hand, if the cost impact is low and the impact is more based on service delivery or customer satisfaction, perhaps there will be a greater degree of proactiveness to showcase value to drive home the impact. So that's where I think it's not a judgment on a particular behavior, but it's just a manifestation of how business is done. So that could be one area where there could be certain resistance from one of the parties to not see this as a win-win, especially when the impact to that party is going to be high. So again, looks counterintuitive, seems counterintuitive, but quite a consistent theme across the range of participants that we surveyed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, going back to what Michael talked about at the start of the webinar, technology enablers such as automation and advanced analytics are leading organizations to adopt output and outcome-based pricing models. Companies that place a greater importance on technology enablers tend to achieve a higher impact from these pricing models. So for example, over 25% of high-impact companies believe that automation and next-generation delivery technologies have significant or high impact on their pricing model changes, whereas only 12% of low-impact companies believe the same. The difference is more marked when considering advanced analytics and reporting, as 45% of high-impact companies versus 25% of low-impact companies believe that these technology enablers are leading to output and outcome-based pricing adoption.
Yeah, and surely this actually doesn't come as a surprise to me, because if you look at, if you start with input-based pricing as a baseline, tracking how many hours someone has logged into a system is relatively simple, right? You have sophisticated programs for that. You could get it off a couple of databases. There's not too much of a tussle when it comes to agreeing on that. Right? Now let's add some more complexity. Tracking activity outputs, which are linked to metrics such as invoices or claims, along with their accuracy, timeliness, it requires a strong sense of measurement, right? Multiple different systems, and also, kind of assessing, what really is a complete invoice, what really is a completed claim, what are the handoffs, where does it stop, where does it end, right? It's much more complex, and much as we would like to think, across enterprises and service providers within that ecosystem, there still are gaps. It's not that streamlined, right? So those relationships that have been able to use better reporting and analytics and streamline that, obviously there's a lot more transparency available, and we see more impact coming through that. Now let's add some more.
Abhishek, I got a couple questions here I want to interject, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, so one question here is, how do you measure the outcome? Any standard methodologies, frameworks for measuring outcomes? And I'm going to broaden it to say outputs as well. How do you measure this stuff?
Okay, so see the outcome. Let me start with outcomes. The measurement of outcome, is actually tightly linked to how the outcome is defined, right? So in some cases, the outcome is linked to direct cost savings, right? Or direct kind of revenue impact. In a sales kind of an environment, it's revenue impact. If it's procurement related, sourcing, category management, it's actually cost impact. So then that's directly linked to the baseline that's set and how many savings you can achieve. So that's how typically, the relatively easier parts of the outcomes are measured. Where it gets slightly more complex is where, outcomes have a degree of causality, right? Where you could link a certain part of, for example, the fee linked to broader customer satisfaction, right? Yeah. Or net promoter score, right? Now, is that something which could be linked directly to your service, perhaps? Is that something which is more dependent if it's a product or B2C environment, that the product type was made better or the features were made better? That's when it gets slightly kind of complex, on outcomes. So that's why it's easier when you have a direct sales or a direct cost saving as a metric. If it's more related to, for example, in an e-commerce kind of an environment, how much of an additional throughput or a cart conversion rate can you achieve because you designed the app in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
But there's much more considerations on that.
Yeah, and I think with the output measurements, those are longer term things you can build a sustainable pricing unit based on it. Where you get into outcome, the impact is going to be, or people are going to feel good about paying for that based in much shorter time frames. More of a performance bonus than a sustainable. Hey, I want in perpetuity fees for improving something.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, there's one more question is, do we have benchmarks for this? How do you benchmark this area?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. So let me take it again step by step. So if you look at output-based metrics, yes, as Michael had alluded to, that this is not something new. I think it was around a number of years ago. It kind of went a bit on the back burner, but it's been being used quite materially, especially in IT infrastructure, certain parts of industry-specific BPO over the past many years. So that's quite benchmarkable. The complexity or question again being how you contextualize it to the environment, technology being used, volumes. It's a bit more complex than simple FTE pricing. So that's clearly, yes, that's how you benchmark it, but after due contextualization to what the environment and contract consideration is. When it comes to outcome, I think that's where it ups the ante a bit when it comes to overall contextualization, because it's not just the volumes or it's not just the environment. It's also how the value of how value is articulated. How do you define the outcome? How do you define the value? So there are industry benchmarks for certain established services, like, for example, sourcing and category management. What's the expected fee cut or fee component that a provider can expect related to savings, depending on the categories that they're mentioning. So for some of them, especially, or for example, on the sales side, when it comes to contact center, what's the upsell rate and as a percentage? So there are existing benchmarks for that. It's just how you approach the benchmark, how you approach that project, that varies depending on the relative complexity.
All right, good answers.
All right. Well, if we then move on to the last practice that we want to talk about today, of course, pricing model changes will drive a need to align clauses within service contracts as well. A majority of high impact organizations have responded that the clauses that need adjustment are primarily in the areas of service scope, governance, and service performance. However, it appears that the alignment of intellectual property and termination clauses in the contract do not appear to have a direct correlation or impact over the value an organization realizes from output and outcome-based pricing. So, Abhishek, what do you think about all that?
Sure. So again, this is an interesting topic which does come up in many conversations. Even if we're doing contract reviews, if we're supporting either one of the enterprise side or service provider side on getting to a more equitable contract. Now, pricing model alone is just one cog in the wheel, if I may use the term. Right? The entire contracting ecosystem is equally important. Service scope changes are often needed to define what is an output, right? Or what is an outcome. If I were to take an example, if you're moving from an FTE-based contract, you're basically tracking the number of hours spent or the number of people who are doing that work in the broader context of the volume of work, right? So that's what's tracked, that's what's decided, and there's an SOW on what the person needs to do. If you're moving that to an output-based contract, then obviously you've got to define the metric changes, right? Because then you've got to define what's the number of invoices processed, what's the number of claims that are done, what counts as a complete claim, what does not count as a complete claim, right. How do you adjust for things like accuracy, how do you adjust for things like timeliness, how do you adjust for things like when the volume threshold for that day goes beyond. So as you see, there's a lot more moving parts that come into play. And what that does is it has implications on how you define the statement of work, right? How you define the scope of services. Because again, I sound like a broken record, but it's all about the basics. I know these are not fancy sounding words. They're not exciting to talk about, but hear me out. This is important stuff, right? And that often gets overlooked towards, more fancy sounding terms. Right? So again, coming back to the point where, things like rights of recourse, things like the basic scope definition appears to be important as the numbers show. Now, conversely, one of the things, and you can call it kind of business psychology as I speak about, if when you've just changed the model, pricing model, you're thinking of making a major change, the automatic top priority coming to mind if it's about termination clauses, I'd rather venture to say that this could automatically mean a sense of distrust in the relationship, right? Because that's a major change. That's how you perhaps want to kind of run through. So these could generally tend to be more counterproductive. And as we see, the enterprises that seem to focus more on termination and some of those elements, or how do you completely manage the risk, seem to be counterintuitive.
Okay, let's go on to some of these more. We got a lot of questions here, and I'm going to pick on a couple of them. But when I summarize this, I started the conversation with what's on the invoice is where the relationship eventually evolves to or devolves, depending on the case, and it always comes back to you pay for what you get. So let me pick on one of these questions here. Has the outcome and outpaced pricing, limited to BPS IT, IT services like where we focused here, or do you think it's going to gain traction in next gen digital services like industrialized AI or other value-based services?
Yeah, that's a good question, and Michael, feel free to chip in. Given that some of the recent thought and themes you've been working on as well, and surely you too. So the way I see it, that especially when it comes to outcome-based pricing, one of the tenets of outcome-based pricing, which tends to be at odds with the oft used theme of, hey, let's get to the lowest cost, is that outcome-based pricing is all about value, right? So outcome-based pricing is based on the theme that you'd rather spend 400 and get value of 1600 rather than spend 200 and get value of 700 or 600. So it's that delta between the two, right, that counts rather than the floor of how much you should spend. Yeah. Right? So I think that's where when we talk about some of the next generation themes around AI, around use of smart automation, right, or intelligent automation, depending on who's using the term. I think that's going to play a very key role because there it's not going to be FTE based, it's not going to be on a transaction based. It's all about how much of value you can deliver, right? And value could be in terms of throughput, accuracy, in terms of the ability to handle huge variations in volume, so to speak, because there's a complete delinkage from people needed to do the work. Machines can easily go up or down, or they can be downscaled. So I think as coming back, as we go into more of these themes, next generation themes, I think that's going to be much more linkage to an outcome-based model. Now, having said that, these are still early days. Many of these themes are still in pilot mode. Many of these things need to be fleshed out to see how it actually works. So do we have some really concrete examples at the moment? No. Do we have some interesting conversations that we're being part of? Yes. So it remains to be seen how this space evolves.
Yeah, and other way I look at that is there is no alternative. We have to move away from something where we're at right now. So as we move to more digital, what you don't want to do is have your service provider that's based on FTE pricing in their invoice say, hey, I don't want to change because my revenues will go down. And I've heard some of the service providers acknowledge that and say, hey, I need to shrink to grow. So I need to be able to shrink my contract and automate and do the right thing for the customer. And that's good. That's good, but we need to think about where they're going in the future. And I think it's automation is designed to reduce the number of human effort and consequently, especially for some of the lower level tasks, it's designed to specifically reduce that headcount. So unless you're aligned on the pricing elements, you're going to find yourself running into a really tough time there, making progress in a renegotiated deal. And there's a comment that's similar to this here. I think it's more of a comment than a question. I'll bring it up here. Is outcome-based pricing maybe more for transformation-based projects and programs? And I think I would agree with that. I mean, the outcome in many cases is going to be more performance-based. And again, there should be benefit, but it's probably benefit recognized over, a shorter period of time and, maybe a one-time objective or a series of performance goals that are hit. But again, at the same time, I go back to what you said, Abhishek. You can't be saying that I'm going to give you a performance bonus or an outcome improvement payment for in perpetuity necessarily, because the cause and effect relationship has to be there. So it makes sense for a year or two, but if the outcome is, hey, I improved your customer service or I improved your whatever goal you're trying to go after, you improved it, but that's what you'd improved was 4 years ago. It's going to be hard for people to understand why they're still paying you for that improvement. All right, here's another question. I'll leave to you two. Most outsourcing providers are struggling to maintain the quality of the workforce. So why would a BPO ever agree to such output-based pricing, given their resources not ready to handle this?
Well, one thing that we have seen actually, and we do talk to service providers quite often, the conversation that comes up over and over again for them is actually their workforce challenges. And I can assure the audience here that all the service providers that we're talking to are actively facing the same type of talent challenges that companies are facing as well. Looking for people that have advanced digital and data science type of capabilities, but also preparing the workforce that may be impacted through this to tackle more value-adding type of activities. So I would just say that while it's still kind of a journey, service providers are actively, developing strategies to address those kind of workforce challenges.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a couple questions around the incentive for the service provider. So here's one. It says, what is the incentive for service providers to change from traditional pricing to either an output or outcome? What is your opinion for the service provider for adopting this? So let's talk about the service provider perspective here for a second. Why should they do this? And why should they not? What should keep them from looking at this as a negative?
Yeah, so I'll take that one first, and please feel free to chip in. So from service provider perspective, there's two angles here, right? One is that given the state of the industry, we're seeing a lot of anti-incumbency, right? So anti-incumbency, not in the traditional terms that people are upset or enterprises are upset. They may be having a fairly good relationship, but they just want more, right? And sometimes they see a bit of an inertia, and there's a tendency to move from one provider to another attacker who may be offering a great deal or a very transformed solution from day one, right? So I think that's one of the push for incumbents to kind of make sure that their solution, their approach, their pricing models and quantum are not totally out of sync with the market. Minor gaps here and there are fine in certain areas, as long as you have a great service. Even some fairly material gaps are fine. But if everything is out of sync, be prepared for high levels of anti-incumbency and move of business from your organization to the others. So that's one. The second element is also that when you get into outcome-based pricing models, a lot of one of the key considerations also is that the enterprise has to cede some level of control, right? You cannot have the same quote unquote staff augmentation or just FTE-based models and that same level of control. If it's based on outputs or outcomes, service providers will get more responsibility and control over the process, right? So what that does is that in a way it delinks the FTEs needed or people needed to deliver the service as against really contracting for outcomes and outputs. And what that does is that it creates additional opportunities to increase profitability. Because as we know, there was a question on talent as well. There's problems on attrition, finding the right kind of talent, managing them, making sure that you're keeping them up to speed on quality. Now, a lot of that gets delinked with some of these models. So while revenue may take a hit, there is a counter which comes up, which is the positive that the profitability may go up, right? So again, these are two angles. One, if I may use a crude term, one is the carrot and the stick, right? Both elements which kind of would push service providers to be in sync with the right kind of models in the market.
Yeah, and what I would have to kind of add to that is that I think the traditional kind of input-based pricing models and the growth potential around that value proposition is very well known. And when it's very well known, it also becomes limited, right? Whereas if you move to more of an output or an outcome-based pricing model, from a service provider's perspective, there is potentially greater potential for them to grow that much quicker. And if they could do that and demonstrate that they could they could deliver value back to an organization faster than their competition can, then they can take on more market share, right? So it's really, for them, I think, there is that additional kind of business growth opportunity to deliver something that clearly, you know, we're seeing a trend that the market is wanting.
Correct.
Yeah. All right, there's a question here. It's more definitional. I just want to provide clarity here. It says, aren't all FTE-based pricing models based on outputs anyway? The number of FTEs specified is based upon data transactions, and therefore there is no real difference between input and output pricing. And I think we need to talk about that for a second here. So the input we're calling here is FTEs. That's the amount of labor to do that. The output would be the actual transaction. So the claims process, whatever the transaction happens to be, that can vary based on the level of automation, and it's not dependent on the FTEs. So with automation coming into play here, one way of doing it may yield you 10 transactions per hour per FTE. Another way may yield you 25 transactions. And so there is in our minds anyway, there is a big difference between pricing on an input being an FTE or other component of cost and service, and the output. So the output is clearly usually based on a business output, where the goal is to streamline the inputs behind the scenes. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
Yeah, Michael, thanks. Yeah, that's a good context. And if I were to kind of just use maybe another lens and using an example. So if you look at an input-based pricing, so the enterprise is paying for the number of people who are doing that work, right? The main difference between these two kind of models is the amount of flex available. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. On an input-based pricing, you're right. The initial baselining is done based on volumes, right? That, hey, this is going to be 20,000 invoices. For this, we'll typically need this kind of number, right? And then we'll see how it goes and move it up or down. The problem is that if you start at 20 FTEs, that number does not flex as soon, if volumes were to go up and down. You've got to wait for 1 or 2 months, either use spare capacity, some buffer capacity, and because you're contracting for a number of people, there's really no incentive to make the people more efficient. Right? So that's why that's the linkage, and the flex is very limited. You're paying for 15, you'll potentially keep on paying for 15, 16, or 14 until there's a major change in volumes and you leave it slide. Right? That's one. Now contrast that with when you're paying per invoice or per transaction or per call. There's a certain baseline volume in which you operate, but then you're paying on a per output basis. Right? Even if volumes were to move one way or the other, 1 month or on a weekly or monthly basis, you have additional resource charge and reduced resource credit mechanisms, so that you don't need to keep on paying unnecessarily for unutilized capacity. Or if you need to flex up very soon, there is an option available without needing to add an FTE. So I think that's the difference, and a lot of it has to do with how providers are incentivized to A, provide more flex, and B, also to incentivize productivity.
All right, and we're only going to get to about 10 or 15% of the questions. There are so many questions that we're trying to get to, so we'll try to have to address some of them afterwards. But let me give you one last question, and I think this is a really good one to end on. What could stop an organization from exploring, or what could or should, I would probably rephrase it a bit there. What could or should stop an organization from exploring an output or outcome pricing model?
Interesting, and this is something which does come up, right? In a number of organizations where even though there is intent, there's a lot of discussion which happens, but 2 years after that discussion, you still feel that they're working on FTE-based pricing. So a couple of things. One is sometimes there's a fear of upsetting the apple cart, as you may call it, right? Any kind of pricing model change means a change in working methods. It's just not a contractual change. You've got to change how things are measured, how the service provider behaves, how you even receive the services, right? Because that's linked to behavior. So first of all is fear of upsetting the apple cart. The second also is, and many times it does happen when the baselining is not done correctly, is that there are sometimes, and there are enough war stories in this, that due to a change in model, the price has actually shot up. And I saw another question related to, how does output-based pricing work in terms of volumes, and is it suited for high volume or low volume? It's not about high volume or low volume, it's about the right baselining of volume, right? So I was just speaking personally about a couple of weeks ago to one of our high technology industry clients, and they had this exact same situation for a team which vendors they were delivering great work using FTE-based pricing. They said, hey, why don't we use it on a per incident basis or per ticket basis? And at 20% lesser volumes, the price went up by 40%. Boom, right? So nothing is wrong with the model. Nothing is wrong with any of the parties. The only thing that went wrong was that the volumes baselined were incorrect. Right? So that's why, because of those incorrect volumes or certain opacity which came into committing to the kind of volumes, the provider will bake in a lot of risk premium, which is broadly unnecessary. And that's what causes what we call pricing bloat. So these are kind of these are two specific reasons. One is fear of upsetting the apple cart. How do you deal with the change? And two, there's an innate fear of hey, what if it goes the other way around, right? And on point B, when I mentioned about what happens the other way around, I gave you an example of output-based pricing. On outcome-based pricing, there's always a fear within enterprise procurement, within enterprise stakeholders, that if we, because outcomes is more of a risk and reward, right? Kind of a model. What if, due to some reason they overachieve all of their targets, and we end up paying much more, right? So no one likes to. Everyone wants to get value, right? Everyone hates to pay even $1 extra for that. So it's that open-endedness sometimes of, or the perception of outcome-based pricing being very open-ended, which creates some kind of a phobia, if I may say.
Yeah, and I think that you go back to some of the historical origins of where we got to right now, and there was a lot of in the early 2000s and over the last decade or so, there was a lot of your mess for less, and labor arbitrage was a core value component. And so the only way that they would just want to say, hey, we're going to move 100 people to India or Eastern Europe or other low cost locations, and we know it's going to be cheaper, so let's focus on that and we'll build a deal around that, and how fast can you make that happen? And so I think we're now maturing past that. Automation's creating a new sense of, hey, you're giving me the wrong incentive, because you're not incenting me. From a service provider standpoint, if you base it on FTEs, again, you're back to no incentive to automate, because that's actually going to lower my revenues. And we got to get past that mentality. But on the enterprise side, we've also got to, on the buyer side, we've got to make sure that we're not obsessed with understanding, trying to, nitpick the margins of our providers. And so from an enterprise standpoint, do you really need to know how many FTEs are doing is that the important part, or is it better to focus on getting a good deal from from an overall output? And if you got a competitive marketplace, you should be able to do pricing based on an output. I'm a little skeptical on outcome for everything, but an output, but an outcome basis for everything might be a little hard to do, but output should be fairly achievable if you've got a competitive marketplace. So with that, let's bring this to a close and Q&As. I've got tons and tons of questions here. We'll try to do follow-up answers too. I wanted to give you, Abhishek, just a second here to talk about your practice.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So just a quick recap on Everest Group's pricing assurance practice. We serve both sides of the table, enterprises and service providers, along with enabling entities, as we may call them, to effectively get to one objective, equitable contracts by a range of custom and syndicated or membership offerings. So again, there's been a lot of questions. Happy to speak in detail at any point in time should such a need arise at any of your organizations.
All right, perfect. And Abhishek's contact information was on that page right there we just passed. I also want to remind participants here that we have lots of information on the website, blogs, and our research. So you can find it there at Sherpas and Blue Shirts, or just go to the main website. You can find the blog link, and there is a ton of related content. There's tons and tons of content that we've accumulated over the years. Probably the one that's most interesting is well, we can look at any of this, the pricing or the mechanisms there for our services. So with that, I think I turn it back to you, Lucy.
Yes, thank you again to Michael, Shirley, and Abhishek, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, Working on an Outdated Pricing Model, Discover the Latest in Outsourcing Prices. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation for today's webinar. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.